Dreaming of a better sleep? Tossing and turning is not your destiny. And Ollie is here to help. Ollie invites you to sink into sweet, sweet slumber to improve your mental and physical health and overall wellness. More than just melatonin, Ollie's ingredients help you unwind your mind for a delightfully dreamy drift off. Sleep is on the way at Ollie.com. That's OLLY.com.
Today on CityCast Boise, tiny homes are a viral sensation on social media, but did you know they're actually illegal in Boise? Bart Cochran, founder of the nonprofit LEAP, is using these illegal homes as a strategy to create more affordable housing. Plus, he shocks me by describing housing in a way I've never heard before. It's Thursday, March 21st. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Hey Bart, it's so good to have you on CityCast Boise.
Thanks, Lindsay. Nice to see you.
It's so good to see you too. So let's just jump right in. Boise's housing market was red hot during the pandemic. How would you sum up the Boise housing market currently, especially when it comes to affordable housing?
We are probably in the moment of least affordability that we ever have been. And the reason for that is that we have median home prices at just hovering there at all-time highs. And although we've seen wage increases over year, they're very, very limited. And so the speed at which housing costs, which we kind of pin at about 4 times the rate of wages, housing costs are going up 4 times the rate of wages, just puts the affordability way out of whack. And then you throw on top of that the cost of capital. So interest rates are doubled from a year ago. And construction costs, although there was some prediction that we'd see some softening of construction costs, have not really materialized. So you have construction costs are relatively high. You have essentially a doubling of interest rates from a year ago. You're still hovering at the highest median home prices that the valley's had, and wages have not improved enough to really make much of a dent at all in those things together. So we think we're at a peak of unaffordability from a housing perspective right now.
Wow, that feels a little unexpected to me because we all saw the news in 2021 when Boise was listed as one of the most overpriced or inaccessible housing markets in the country. And so I think maybe there was this perception that it was getting better, but you're saying with all of those factors, it's really not.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, it really comes down to payment. Unless you're going to see a really significant decrease in the cost of housing, which we haven't, what we're focused on as a nonprofit housing provider in the community, we're focused on that 80% of area median income target audience, so about a third of the community overall. And that's the group that has the most price sensitivity. So we're not necessarily talking about somebody who's got a boatload of wealth to roll forward into our community or lots of equity. They are much less susceptible to these challenges. It's sort of that core working portion of our community that is right on the edge of affordability. At 80, we would say that anybody at 80% of area median incomes, a third of the households and below, will struggle to access the cost of housing today. That number, we've been tracking it for the last decade. A household, on average, will spend 55% of their income on housing if they try to access a home at median price in the community.
So that is wild. And I want to dig into that just a little bit more because when you talk about 80% of the median income for Boise, that can kind of feel like an abstract amount. So let's talk about that in real numbers. In 2023, for one person, that was right around $50,000. For a family of 3, that was $62,500. Just to kind of put that in perspective, as a nurse with 3 to 4 years of experience, last year I made $63,000 gross. So when we talk about there being an affordable housing crisis, I think that people sometimes assume that this would only affect people who are unemployed or working part-time, but nurses, social workers, teachers, librarians, and paraeducators are all making salaries that would place them right in that range, especially if they're single parents. So if people in these professions are struggling to afford housing in this area, how are our baristas and waiters and other members of the community supposed to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you nail it. I think that's one of the things that we bring up really often. You hear about like not in my backyard, movements.
Oh, yes.
And I think one of the things that's so important for people to understand is how large of an audience is impacted by this. These are school teachers and these are first responders. It's a much wider audience that is struggling to access housing, and the bulk of those folks that are experiencing that are employed. These are core workforce, households in our community. And so, if you go downline, we call this deeply skewing.
Okay. I was going to say that's probably really interesting information that not everybody is aware about. So I wanted to bring you on because I really want to focus on your work with tiny homes and using tiny homes as a solution to this affordability crisis. So I wanted to ask you about this pilot program that you're doing. But before we get into the details, I wanted to let everybody know that tiny homes are actually illegal in Boise. What's up with that?
Yeah, that's so interesting. We're doing a pilot using illegal building products. Yeah. Go figure, right? So, the city of Boise asked LEAP to there was a kind of a RFP that went out.
RFP. I'm so sorry. I'm going to need help with all the acronyms.
Request for proposal. So we proposed that we would run this pilot for the city, and it was part of their innovation program, and it was revolving around the idea of tiny homes, something that comes up very often in the community. As what if tiny homes could be the solution? So I think the question was, is it the solution? Let's figure that out. And so one of the particular challenges, and by tiny homes, we want to define this. So we're talking about tiny homes. We're talking about tiny homes on wheels.
Oh, okay. That's an important distinction.
So it doesn't mean that you couldn't have a 200 square foot house on a foundation in your backyard. That might be perfectly fine as long as it meets all the city codes. But what happens with tiny homes on wheels is because they're oftentimes built on a chassis, like a trailer, let's call it that. They oftentimes can come out of the purview of city planning. So they don't. You don't necessarily apply for what would be typical building permits. And so the thinking is that you can create an artificially lower housing product by building it this way. And so the question is could we place a series of tiny homes throughout the community, obtain feedback, look at the results of that pilot for the city to be able to have the information to examine whether this is a building product that they want to make as a legal building product in the community.
I was going to just ask, so is the city looking at potentially changing this law based on your program and the outcome of what happens with these tiny homes?
Well, that's a great question. We can't speak for the city because we don't know what they're thinking. But we can tell you that they're deeply interested in finding creative solutions to the housing challenges. And this is one of the areas that they wanted to explore to learn what it is that they needed to learn. It's difficult, right, to understand something unless you've got at least a pilot to be able to look to say, what's the data tell us? Is this an affordable? Is it affordable? Is it safe? Like, for example, can you place a tiny home on wheels and ensure that the occupants are going to be, the health and standards of that unit are going to be safe? Does the connecting of the tiny home into the city's infrastructure, power, sewer, water, is it compatible? Things like that. One of the things we've learned, we've just placed our first tiny home. So we've officially placed the first one.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. It was it was quite the experience to get through this process. There's no shortage of interest. We're going to expand it from this first one. One of the interesting things that we've been needing to create is essentially a marketplace, because we have site owners who have an interest in having a space for somebody to put a tiny home on
Mm-hmm.
wheels. But we also need to pair them up with a person who owns a tiny home on wheels. But the challenge is that you have somebody who owns what is considered an illegal building product. They're not exactly interested and getting on the radar. And so we've had to
not
sort of
really.
nurture that a little bit to try to build those connections for folks. So in this next, now that we've kind of worked the kinks out with this first one, we're allowed to a handful of other units placed. And so we're going to start getting the word out there to kind of let people know that we're going to try to do a little bit of matchmaking to pull the rest of these together.
Yeah, it's such an interesting issue in this area because they're illegal. Because when you think about tiny homes, they're everywhere on social media. They've been incredibly trendy. There are hashtags and influencers just like completely committed to this tiny home lifestyle. There's entire channels just talking about how to decorate or live within these tiny homes. So it's so interesting that because they're illegal, there's kind of this hesitancy in this area to be open about having these properties. And so what about these tiny homes or having these tiny homes is so promising to LEAP and to you as a solution to this affordable housing crisis we're facing?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, they're much more, they're very conducive to factory building. And a lot of as you can, social media would show you, people built it in their backyard using scrap materials, and and so there's this idea that you can artificially bring the cost of a housing unit down significantly. Mm-hmm. And the magic, I think, is maybe it just so happens that I might be able to put quite a bit of sweat equity into building this unit, mm-hmm. so I might be able to have it free and clear because I can just pay for it out of cash. And then the other thing is that it moves. So if I want to live here for a while, I can. If I want to move to another city, I can. And I get to bring that house with me, and it doesn't necessarily require me to sell it in order for me to relocate. The hope is that when tiny homes on wheels are built to standard and built to scale, that we can see a significant decrease in the cost of those homes.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely something more appealing to especially millennials, Gen Z, where, there's been lots of discussion about their finances and how they're struggling in specific ways that other generations haven't. That I agree with you. I think this could be a really interesting and innovative solution for them. We're talking about the popularity of these tiny homes. Are there any programs where something like this has been successful in other parts of the country for helping people who otherwise couldn't afford a more traditional single-family home?
We have seen some interesting strategies, maybe less around the tiny home side of things, and maybe a little bit more around the ADU. It seems like that's the most
ADU.
Oh yeah, accessory dwelling units is also a part of our pilot that we're doing with the city, and that is an ADU is oftentimes the secondary unit that is on a property that you own. So so it's oftentimes we sometimes used to call it the mother-in-law suite. So it's like oftentimes detached. Sometimes it's an attached, like a converted garage. It can be, but you see them a little bit more frequently now in the north end. Is where we're seeing a little bit. North end of Boise is a little bit more common, and usually they're relatively small footprint. Although the city of Boise expanded their ADU program with the latest zoning rewrite, you can now build up to a 900 square foot home in your backyard. Used to be limited to be much smaller than that. And so we've seen cities find incentives to be able to increase the production of ADUs, streamline the process, so like pre-approved sets of plans, strategies like that to really increase the prevalence of these secondary units. And so what we're doing is sort of taking that historically single-family detached structure, and what we're doing is just sort of moving the density up a little bit to try to help people be able to find a more attainable housing option that's close to the center, that they don't have to necessarily move to where it's less expensive, maybe to the edge of town.
Yeah. Help everybody stay more centrally located where they're working and living and going to school.
We think there's a lot of promise around the affordability side of the ADUs. The pilot specifically is geared around that. The idea is where the city's offering an incentive homeowners that want to build an ADU to build it and then also restrict the income. So they can restrict the rent so that it's serving a low income household. One of the particular challenges with the ADU program in this pilot is that interest rates doubled just after we started the pilot, and construction costs have stayed elevated. And so homeowners are having a harder time committing to the cost of building. There's been a lot of like projects that have been ideated but kind of shelved while interest rates are elevated. And then knowing that it's going to cost a little bit more to build my ADU and I have to restrict the income has made the business decision for folks just a little bit harder. So that has been one of the particular challenges with this pilot around the ADU side.
Shipping can make or break a sale, so optimize how you ship your orders with ShipStation. They make it easy to automate and manage orders no matter how big your business grows. And they might even be able to help reduce shipping and warehouse costs. So optimize and keep up your momentum for growth with ShipStation. Sign up for your free 60-day trial now at ShipStation.com and use the code POD. That's ShipStation.com with the code POD.
Historically, there have been negative perceptions that affordable housing is unattractive or poorly constructed or crafted in such a way that it will decrease property values for neighbors. So how has LEAP addressed these concerns?
That's a great question. We would start by probably just making sure that it's clear that we have yet to see any data or like quantitative research that would prove out any of that. In fact, Zillow did a really interesting study that actually determined that there is an increase in value through the creation of what they would consider mixed income housing product. And so nobody has yet shown us that that's true, but stigma does exist. And that is a real big challenge. I think part of it is around like what we talked about earlier, people understanding that what they may have viewed as the audience that is struggling to afford the cost of housing may be a much wider audience than they maybe had originally thought. And so as a result, I think that there's a lot of education that's needed. The other is that we can say that all we want, but the more we can demonstrate it and give people an opportunity to see housing that is well designed, that fits within neighborhoods, that is of high quality, that's durable, the more we can really move the needle on some of those challenges. And so we refer to that actually as dignifying housing. So our target is something that's
I love that.
It's something that we think is like, it's a little bit more qualitative when we think about it. It's hard for us to analyze, was that dignifying or was that not? And what we do is, this is a good example. We have a slide presentation and we'll be in front of a group of people, for example. And when we have one slide that's just dedicated to interior photos of the houses that we build, real photos. And what we most often find is that the audience will go, oh, those are so nice. And we ask the question, why did you respond in that way? And what we find is that there's a low bar for what is expected for affordable housing. So we kind of refer to that as adequate housing. Well, it's good enough, right? And that's not our view. Our view is that we want places that people feel proud about bringing their family and their friends. We're listening for the homeowners who are purchasing from the Community Land Trust or the newest resident of one of our rental properties to be able to say, I'm so proud of where I live. Why we care about dignity is that we think it's the gateway for human flourishing. So when we view housing, we view it on a stair step. So meaning people are moving from I need an immediate place to live all the way up to the greatest wealth building tool for low income households, which is home ownership. And we can point to great examples of people who have been able to access some really incredible opportunities because they were given those doors were opened for them.
Well, and I thank you so much. I really appreciate your focus on that. As a newlywed, we lived in affordable housing, low income housing. And I do feel like there was this perception of it should be good enough for you, or like you should just be grateful to have housing. And so, or there even was kind of sort of a shame attached to it. You should have a certain level of shame for living in this housing. So just on a very personal level, I very much appreciate wanting to dignify that even if you are in low income housing, if you are living in these units, that you're still a person, you still deserve dignity, that having housing is a basic need and shouldn't require you to perform a certain level of shame to be able to have it.
I appreciate you saying that. That's something that we are listening for and we know exists. It's there. Our experience would say that your experience that you just expressed is not uncommon. And so we want to change that as much as we can because we think that there's a linkage between that dignity and the idea of human flourishing. And so we need to eliminate the shame element of it as rapidly as possible.
I think that is fantastic and is so important for people who need affordable housing to have a house that you feel is attractive, that you don't feel embarrassed that this is very clearly low income housing. I love the idea that you want to give them this attractive, affordable place to live. I think that speaks to what I think in Boise we want to have, is that all the members of our community feel welcome and supported regardless of their income.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So you have said that LEAP has a goal of building 1,000 affordable homes by 2026 in the Treasure Valley. Are you on track to meet that goal?
You're going to put me on the spot. Okay, well, I'm going to just qualify one thing. So we actually are 1,000 housing opportunities by 2026.
Oh, okay.
And I want to just give that a little bit of distinction. So the answer to your question first is yes. We are making great strides in that direction, and I'm very optimistic that we'll hit the number by 2026. But what's really important about understanding how our organization is focused is we focus on 3 tracks. We would say home ownership, rental housing, and preservation. So when we build and develop home ownership or rental housing, of course, we're creating a new home, but we're also watching for opportunities or situations in which existing affordable housing has the risk at leaving the market. Because that's, to us, just as important. And the reason for that is we think of the housing world as like a leaky bucket, right? It's a bucket. We're building a new house and we're putting it in the top of it. But if there's a hole in the bottom and we just lost an affordable home, came out of the market. So the examples would be expiring affordable housing projects, meaning their funding is expiring and so they can be converted to market rate. Or the most common that we see is what we call naturally affordable housing, which would be like a manufactured housing community. Mm-hmm. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that we're plugging as many of those holes as we can at the bottom of the bucket, so that when we're adding new units to the top, we're actually making forward progress. And so that's why we say opportunities, is that sometimes we're actually preserving the opportunity for people to stay affordably housed. And then sometimes we're creating a brand new opportunity for people to access housing. But yes, we're on track and things are looking very good for 2026.
I think that's so interesting that you brought that up, because I guess that's never been part of a discussion I've seen had about this, that it's not just about new units or new houses or new housing, but preserving the housing that we have. So I think that is really such an important part of this conversation. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Do you have specific strategies that LEAP is employing to maintain the preservation of those houses or those housing units?
Mm-hmm. Probably the most common one that folks will see is we're an affiliate of what's called Rock USA, and we sort of acquire manufactured housing communities. What we do is we actually just put it under contract, and then we organize the residents. And in manufactured housing, usually the residents own their houses, but they don't own the land. So it creates a really housing unstable situation in the sense that the landlord can raise the rents, the landlord could just repurpose the property altogether, or they could let the systems fail. They could let the water and sewer systems fail. So what we do is we purchase the land, then we organize the residents, and we sell the land to the residents. So the residents end up owning both their home, and they're a shareholder in a corporation that now owns the land. So they actually ensure that they can stay stably housed forever. Otherwise, most notably, we purchased the Golden Glow Tower in Nampa. It's the tallest building in Nampa, and it's a senior housing project with very low income. And so the original developer, all the federal funding had expired. And so it needs some rehabilitation, like physically it's kind of aged. It's from 1969. And so, but the key is that we're doing it with a zero displacement strategy, meaning that none of the residents have to leave and their rent should not be materially impacted. It should remain affordable. So those are just a couple of two kind of particular examples.
Before we let you go, what is Boise doing right? And what is maybe Boise doing wrong in terms of affordable housing?
Let me just start with what the city's doing right. So the city just finished this massive undertaking, which was the rezone. There are definitely some attributes of that zoning code that are positive for organizations like ours that are attempting to create housing in the community. So I think there's going to be some really neat opportunities. The city's also taking seriously resources that it has access to try to create housing in the community. I don't know if I can answer any really bad things. However, what I can tell you is that in particular, Idaho is challenged. And what I mean by that is that we have seen such a drastic increase in the cost of housing in relationship to the income that an average person has here, that it has made it very, very unaffordable. There are other communities where housing costs have increased at a pace that's higher than wages. That's not an uncommon scenario. But what normally happens in a state is that you pivot to say, we now need the resources to be able to increase the production of below market rate housing so that we can make sure that there's housing for folks that are on the edge of affordability. And so in 47 other states, there is a state resource that's mixed with federal resources that allows that production to move forward. Idaho is one of 3 states in the nation that does not have a state resource for housing production. So I think what we need and what we, if you have to say, we have a wish list. The wish list is that the state would consider, and more cities like Boise would consider allocating resources specifically to help create and produce housing so that we can really move the needle. Our organization has been creating a loan fund, what we would call a social impact loan fund. And so that's one way. It's a slow way to do it. What we need those types of resources, but we also need this to be a public policy issue and to see more funds get allocated from a state perspective.
Hopefully the legislature or some governing body someday will responsibly try to take the actual issues of our community up so that we could have access to those resources.
Yep. And that what's really important is that from a legislative perspective, the community, we would just encourage, this is what we call a water cooler issue. And what we mean by water cooler is that folks are standing around talking about it. Oh man, my rent just went up. Oh, my kids are still living in my basement. But it's not yet a public issue. So we need people to start committing their voices and their resources to the issue, because it has to be a public issue before it's ever a public policy issue. So the legislators are going to need to hear from the people of Idaho that this is not only just an issue, but it's an issue we want them to do something about.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you for those actionable steps to move forward. I know sometimes just living here and being here, you can feel kind of powerless or at the whim of the legislature. So thank you for these actionable steps to move that needle or start having those discussions. So hopefully we can move that direction. Thank you so much.
You bet.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone else who's frustrated with the housing market? You can also get more news by subscribing to our Hey Boise newsletter. Catch you tomorrow.